under the golden sun of the Ottoman Empire, where the scent of jasmine mixed with whispers of ambition. One woman rose from the depths of slavery to the height of imperial power. Her name was Hurrem Sultan, but she was not born into luxury or royal privilege. She was once just Alexandra, a young girl from the cold lands of Ruthenia, where snow kissed the fields and silence carried the fear of invasion. Her laughter once echoed in a small wooden house, surrounded by love, before the Ottomans' dreaded Tatar allies swept through her village. In a single night, everything she knew turned to ash. Her family was killed, and she was chained, sold like a piece of property in the dark corridors of the slave market in Istanbul. Yet fate, unpredictable and ruthless, had chosen her for something greater. Within the walls of the Topkapi Palace, a place of beauty secrets and silent wars, Alexandra's sharp mind and radiant charm caught the attention of the most powerful man in the world, Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent. Among hundreds of concubines, she stood apart, not just because of her red hair or dazzling smile, but because of her ability to make the Sultan laugh to challenge his intellect, to make him feel alive in ways no other woman dared. The young Sultan, known for his strict discipline and political brilliance, found himself disarmed by her warmth and wit. He renamed her Hurrem, meaning the cheerful one. But behind that cheerful smile burned a mind sharper than any blade forged in the empire. Hurrem knew that in a palace built on beauty and betrayal, survival depended not on loyalty, but on control. Each night, as music echoed through the harem's marble halls, she watched the women around her rivals dressed in silk but armed with daggers of jealousy. Hurrem studied them, learned their weaknesses, and used her intelligence as her greatest weapon. Slowly, she became more than a lover. She became a confidant, an advisor, the woman who could whisper ideas into the Sultan's ear that would change the fate of nations. Her influence grew, and so did the enemies within the harem. Hurrem Sultan, the mother of Suleiman's firstborn son Mustafa, saw Hurrem as a dangerous threat. Their rivalry burned hotter than the fires of Topkapi's kitchens. Every glance between them carried poison. Every word dripped with hidden meaning. And then came the turning point, a violent clash that would seal Hurrem's destiny. In one heated confrontation, Mahidevran attacked Hurrem, leaving her bruised and bloodied. When the Sultan saw his beloved's injuries, his heart turned cold toward Mahidevran forever. Hurrem had won her first invisible battle, not by force, but by fate itself. Soon, something unthinkable happened in Ottoman history. A slave woman became the legal wife of the Sultan, a scandal that shook the empire's foundation. Never before had a concubine been elevated to such a position. The powerful viziers murmured in disbelief. The janissaries whispered behind closed doors, and even foreign ambassadors sent urgent letters back home. The Sultan has married his slave, but Hurrem was no longer a slave. She was now Hurrem Sultan, the woman who ruled the heart of an empire. From that moment, her power was unmatched. She wrote letters to kings and queens across Europe, her words delicate yet commanding. Even her enemies respected her intelligence. Yet, power always comes with a price. The empire began to fracture from within. Political rivals rose. Jealous courtiers plotted, and Hurrem's every move was watched by eyes that wished to see her fall. But she never faltered. Behind her smile, she hid storms of strategy. Every alliance she built, every whisper she shared, was part of a larger game. A game only she truly understood in the candlelit silence of her chambers. Hurrem would sometimes remember her past, the girl taken from her homeland, crying in chains. But now she ruled over the same world that once enslaved her. Power had not destroyed her. It had transformed her. She had become a legend in her own time. The slave who became queen. The heart that tamed an empire. Hurrem's rise within the Ottoman court was nothing short of miraculous, but every miracle in the palace carried a shadow. The corridors of Topkapi were lined with gold, yet behind those shining walls were whispers of deceit and danger. Every servant had two faces, every smile hid a dagger, and every ally could turn into an enemy overnight. Hurrem knew that the higher she climbed, the more perilous the air became. By Suleiman's side, she began to shape the destiny of the empire itself. When ambassadors came from faraway lands, they found themselves captivated not only by the Sultan, as authority but also by the soft-spoken woman beside him whose words were measured, whose thoughts were sharp, and whose presence commanded respect without demanding it. Hurrem had mastered the art of influence. She ruled not from the throne, but from the shadows. Her letters to European monarchs were legendary, written in perfect elegance, filled with diplomacy, and veiled with subtle warnings. She was no longer the girl sold at the market. She had become the bridge between East and West, the hidden architect of Ottoman politics. While Suleiman conquered lands with armies, Hurrem conquered hearts and minds with her words. But power rarely comes without sacrifice. As Hurrem's sons grew, so did the storm of succession, a deadly game that had torn countless dynasties apart. Suleiman's eldest son, Prince Mustafa, born of Mahidevran, was loved by the soldiers and adored by the people. He was seen as the rightful heir, the future of the empire. Yet for Hurrem, that meant one undeniable truth. Her own children would always live under his shadow, unless she changed fate itself. Behind her calm and graceful exterior, Hurrem faced a torment only a mother could understand. She knew that if Mustafa ascended the throne, her sons would face exile or death. For in the Ottoman law of succession, only one heir could survive. The throne demanded blood, and Hurrem refused to let it be her children's. Slowly, she began to weave a web, not of lies, but of survival. Through whispers, letters, and subtle moves, she began to shape the Sultan's perception of Mustafa. She reminded him of loyalty, of danger, of betrayal that once brought great empires to ruin. And though she never openly spoke against the prince, the poison of doubt began to seep into Suleiman's heart. The Sultan, once so sure of his firstborn, began to question him. Rumors spread that Mustafa was plotting a rebellion, a tale that history would never confirm, but one that changed everything. When the fatal day arrived, the empire itself seemed to hold its breath. Mustafa was summoned to his father's tent, far from the golden palaces of Istanbul. The prince walked in proudly, unaware that the air around him had already chosen his fate. What happened next was whispered for centuries. Suleiman watched as his own guards turned on his son. The cries of the prince echoed through the tent, and when silence finally fell, a mother's heart somewhere in the harem shattered without a sound. That night, Hurrem's victory came wrapped in sorrow. She had saved her children, but at a cost no heart could bear. The empire wept for the fallen prince, soldiers murmured in grief, and poets cursed the day a mother's ambition could lead to such tragedy. Hurrem herself retreated into silence. She had won, but peace never returned to her soul. Still, history is written by those who survive. After Mustafa's death, Hurrem's sons, especially Suleiman and Bazid, grew closer to the throne. But this new peace was fragile. The same system that had devoured Mustafa would soon demand another sacrifice. Rivalries between the brothers deepened, and Hurrem's heart, once unshakable, began to break under the weight of what she had built. Even as she smiled beside Suleiman, her eyes carried the pain of a woman who knew that every choice she made was stained with blood. The empire outside celebrated its golden age, the age of Suleiman the Magnificent. But inside those marble walls, Hurrem Sultan was fighting a war of her own, one that no one else could see. As years passed, her beauty soft but her influence remained unchallenged. Ministers, generals, and scholars bowed their heads before her. She built mosques, schools, and charities, trying to balance the blood of politics with the blessings of faith. Yet, deep down, she knew the truth, that her story, no matter how glorious, would forever be shadowed by whispers of manipulation and guilt. In the quiet hours of the night, she would stand by the window of her chambers, looking toward the Bosphorus, where the moon reflected on the dark water like a memory of another life, the life of a girl once called Alexandra. For all her triumphs, power had taken her innocence, and though she was the most powerful woman in the empire, there were moments she longed for the freedom she once had before destiny found her. Years began to pass, like the slow turning of pages in a forgotten book. The laughter that once echoed through the marble halls of Topkapi Palace had faded into memories. Hurrem Sultan, the woman who had risen from slavery to become the heart of an empire, was no longer the same bright flame that had captured the Sultan's heart decades earlier. Time had left gentle lines on her face, but behind those lines still burned the same fierce intelligence that once shaped the destiny of a vast empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Yet, even as the empire stood tall, Hurrem knew that the world she had built was beginning to shift beneath her feet. Her sons were now men, each carrying the weight of ambition and jealousy. Prince Selim was indulgent and gentle, more drawn to poetry and wine than politics, while Bayezid was bold, proud, and restless, the fire of youth and rebellion alive within him. Between them, Hurrem saw the shadow of another tragedy forming. She had once fought against destiny to save her children, but now destiny was returning, asking for another price. The same court that once bowed before her now watched her family unravel from within. The same whispers that had once protected her now turned into daggers aimed at her own sons. Suleiman, now older and weary, spent more time in solitude. His victories on the battlefield had made him a legend. Yet even legends are not spared from loneliness. The loss of his son Mustafa had left a permanent scar, and though he never openly blamed Hurrem, a silence began to grow between them. A silence deeper than words, heavier than grief. At night, they still dined together, but their conversations had become like ghosts of the past, circling around memories they could no longer change. He still loved her, that much was clear, but it was a love worn down by years of pain and politics. Hurrem often sat near him, watching his eyes drift to the horizon as if searching for something that time had stolen away. She understood that in the world of rulers and empires, love was never enough to bring peace. Power had its own hunger, one that could never be satisfied. So she turned her focus toward the future, toward her children, determined to secure a stable succession even if her own heart had already begun to break. The rivalry between Bayezid and Selim grew into open hostility. Letters, written in anger, alliances formed in secret. Hurrem could feel history repeating itself. She begged them to find peace, to remember that brotherhood was stronger than ambition, that they were sons of a sultan, and ambition was in their blood. When news of Bayezid's disobedience reached Suleiman, the old sultan's patience finally shattered. For the first time in decades, Hurrem found herself powerless to stop the tide. She tried to reason with him, to remind him of mercy, but his voice was cold, his words final. He had lost one son to rebellion. He would not lose the empire to another. Hurrem's health began to fade under the weight of sorrow. The woman who had once danced through the Hermes halls with laughter now spent her days in prayer, her nights in silence. She looked back on her journey from the snow-covered fields of Ruthenia to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and wondered if destiny had been kind or cruel. She had achieved what no woman before her ever had, a slave who became queen, a captive who became a legend. Yet in her victories, she had also lost pieces of herself that could never be In her final years, Hurrem withdrew from the court's intrigues, finding solace in her charitable works. She built mosques, schools, and soup kitchens, hoping that her good deeds might outlive her name. The great Haseki Hurrem Sultan Mosque in Istanbul still stands today, a monument not only to her power but to her humanity. For every rumor that painted her as a manipulator, there was a deed that showed her compassion. She fed the poor, clothed widows, and ensured that even the forgotten souls of the empire had a place to pray. It was her way of balancing the sins of ambition with the mercy of faith. Suleiman watched her fade with a heavy heart. He, who had seen countless warriors die in his name, was helpless before the slow fading of the woman who had once been his brightest flame. When Hurrem's final illness came, the palace fell into an unnatural quiet. The corridors that once echoed with her laughter now trembled with the weight of grief. Even the Sultan's guards, hardened by war, spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the spirit of a woman whose presence had defined an era. On her last night, Hurrem asked to see Suleiman one final time. The Sultan, old and weary, entered her chamber without his crown or his robe of state. Just a man standing before the woman who had shared his soul. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the years melted away. There were no titles, no politics, no empire, only two souls bound by love and regret. Hurrem's voice was faint, but her words carried the strength of her entire life. She thanked him for freeing her, for believing in her, for letting her dream beyond the chains of her birth. And with a gentle smile, the same smile that had once changed the course of history, she whispered her last prayer and closed her eyes forever. The Sultan did not speak for hours. He sat beside her, holding her lifeless hand, lost in memories of the woman who had been his joy, his sorrow, his companion in both war and peace. When he finally stood, the world outside had already begun to mourn. The body of Hurrem Sultan was laid to rest near the great Suleimani Mosque, the very place her beloved had built to honor God and the greatness of his reign. And even in death, they would not be parted for long. Years later, Suleiman himself would be buried beside her. But her story did not end in that tomb. Centuries later, the name Hurrem Sultan still echoes across the pages of history. To some, she remains the cunning enchantress who manipulated an empire. To others, she is the symbol of courage and intelligence, a woman who defied every rule written by men. She was both saint and sinner, victim and victor, a reflection of the empire itself, beautiful, powerful, and tragic. Ebonine deaths, her legacy shaped the course of generations. The system of royal wives that she established changed the empire forever, giving future queens, the valid sultans, real power in politics. She paved the way for women like Hurrem Sultan and Turhan Hadis to rule behind the veil, showing that strength and intellect were not confined by gender or birth. Hurrem's life proved that destiny could be rewritten, that even from chains, a crown could rise. Today, centuries later, her story still captures hearts around the world, in films, books, and television. Hurrem Sultan lives again. Her laughter, her pain, her ambition immortalized in every retelling. Historians debate her motives, scholars analyze her politics, and artists portray her as both villain and hero. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. She was human, flawed, brilliant, passionate, and brave. She loved fiercely, fought relentlessly, and paid dearly for every dream she dared to chase. And maybe that is why her story endures, because beyond the palaces and politics, beyond the wars and betrayals, Hurrem Sultan's life reminds us that power is never given. It is earned, fought for, and sometimes paid for with the soul itself. She began her life as a nameless girl lost to history, yet she became a woman whose name history could never forget. As the call to prayer echoes across Istanbul and the sunlight glimmers upon the domes of the mosques she built, her spirit still lingers in the air. In the city in the very heart of the empire she once ruled, not with a sword but with her mind and her heart. And so the legend of Hurrem Sultan continues, whispered in every shadowed corner of Topkapi, reminding the world that even a captive can become a queen. And ebb and flow, when bound by fate, can shape the destiny of empires.